Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new retrospective from the Jams and Tea podcast. We finished our Björk retrospective, and like we do, we are moving on now, of course, to I think another essential sort of podcore band that unites us in taste and appreciation, and that is The National.
Yes.
And so now here we are, and I mean, it's probably not going to co-align with Björk quite as well, but a new National album is definitely on the horizon sometime in the near future, I'm guessing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely like that. I think that they have said that they plan to release it in the, I think it was like winter, spring year time. So they are recording it or have at least recorded it in part, I think, or if not in full. So yeah, a new national album is well underway. More importantly, they have been playing new songs at their most recent live show, which is obviously a good sign. They've done that for their previous records as they've debuted new material well in advance of the record coming out as well. So we can expect the Nationals LP9, within the not too distant future. And that, I think, was one big impetus for us to do this, because the National is one of our favorite bands for each of the three of us. And, in 2 years of the Jams and Tea podcast, we've really never talked about them formally. I guess we were sort of assuming that we would do this someday, but we did Radiohead in this format, we did Björk in this format, two of the biggest artists of the last 30 years. And now I think it's time to tackle the National, who are, maybe there's going to be less wild variation between releases than there were with those two previous artists, but I think this series will absolutely make up for that by having more personal connections to these records, personal stories to tell about how important these records are to us, commenting on the storytelling and the songwriting of Matt Berninger, the way that this band gel as a unit so well, and basically the way that they have come to be the face of the indie rock band in recent years. Like, they are one of the most persistent and consistent indie rock bands to come out of that 2000s way, where we were being inundated with bands in this vein, and they really distinctly identified and set out a course for themselves that made them feel like they were going to be in it for the long run with their early records. And they have stuck to the formula, they've tweaked it, they have developed their sound, they have fully identified their niche, and they continue to do it to the absolute peak of its possibilities. So we're going to talk about those. We are going to have guests on for just about every single record in this series as well, to talk about their personal connections to these albums. But we're going to start a little bit more low key with their debut today, one of their most understated records, and generally regarded to be their least substantial or impactful record, but still, I think, a good opportunity to talk about the core members of this band, what they bring to the table, and essentially the signs of what was to come that are present here, I think. And what's interesting to talk about with regard to early the National, so they were formed in 1999 in Cincinnati. They're an Ohio band. They've sung about that, particular the Midwest existence and ennui very, very frequently. And what's interesting is when they started out, they were actually more of an alt country band than an indie rock band. I suppose that the particular style of polished indie rock that they came to be known for wasn't really something that had a clear scene or identity in the early 2000s quite yet. And they would come in a lot of ways to actually lay out that template. And I think we'll make a case as we go through the series that they're kind of one of the most influential bands of the last 20 years, in a certain sense, for laying out a groundwork for not only other indie rock bands, but also a lot of indie rock singer-songwriters, solo artists. They would craft essentially a songbook and a style that many would attempt to imitate, but few have ever really quite nailed the way that they have. And so we need to work towards the times and records with which they would do that. But we need to, of course, start with their debut, which was released in 2001, a self-titled record. And one of the things worth noting about this band is that it is a 5-piece band, and it has been the same 5 people ever since its inception, essentially. Matt Berninger, of course, the vocalist, songwriter, the lead personality of this band. And interestingly, the rest of the band is actually made up of 2 sets of brothers. So we have the twins, Aaron and Bryce Dessner, who are multi-talented, multifaceted musicians who both play the guitar, but also are, talented and contribute other instruments, bass, piano, keyboards, additional instrumentation. They're later in their career, they get more involved, particularly Aaron gets more involved in the production side of the band's music. And the other set of brothers is Brian and Scott Devendorf, the drummer and the chief bassist of the band, respectively. So you have this 5-piece indie rock band, essentially, that, like Radiohead in a lot of ways, has multiple guitarists, has a distinct rhythm section voice in these 2 quite pivotal figures, and of course, an inimitable frontman in the form of Matt Berninger. And so they came together in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, and what they delivered to us with this first record is very much a kind of stately and very, I would say, gin-soaked version of alt country that is not a million miles away from what artists like Bill Callahan were doing around the same time. Although I will say that in comparison to someone like Bill Callahan, there is, who to be fair, is not exactly a super serious artist, but there's a little more irreverence in what the National is doing. There's a little more self-deprecation in what the National is doing on this record. And I would say there is a little less confidence in what the National is doing on this record. I am going to wager that I've probably listened to this album considerably more than either of the 2 of you. So
that's probably fair.
I may have, I guess, the most developed thoughts on individual songs on this record. I'll say off the bat, I like this album. I don't think that it's a bad record. I don't even actually really think that it's an entirely mediocre record, even if it does have some moments that I think aren't as well formed as others. But it is inarguably a record that is a finding their sound sort of album, and they haven't quite found it yet. They are exploring. You get a lot of insights into the motives of songwriting and the themes that Matt Berninger is interested in and will return to on subsequent records. The chief one of those, I suppose, being alcoholism. Matt, I believe, was in the throes of an alcohol addiction in the early period of the National's career. And so a lot of the music in these early records is not only concerned with alcoholism, but also just the tone is so dark and jet black, but also laced with this kind of, as I say, self-deprecating comedy that it kind of becomes a little tonally strange. But yeah, anyway, I'll get into that in a little more detail. We can talk about that. But you guys are both National fans. I'm presuming that, like me, this is one of the records that you would have come to later in the discography. So I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of how the band sound at this particular era and what, if anything, stands out to you about this particular album.
I think the word I would use to describe this album is modest. It almost feels like it was designed to be the unassuming debut of a great band. That doesn't make any sense, but they're clearly taking so many notes from their contemporaries like Wilco and
there's a bit of Will Oldham in here as well, and I'm trying to think of the other alt country staples, like that band that Jeff Tweedy and Jay Farrar were in before Wilco, Uncle Tupelo. That's it. There's definitely a lot of, you can refer to references points like Uncle Tupelo and Sun Volt, Bonnie Prince Billy. I've already mentioned Bill Callahan, the Jayhawks, those sorts of alt country bands that were sort of populating the underground in the 90s, and they were definitely kind of coming out of that scene. the Jayhawks are a good reference point actually, because they're another sort of Midwestern band. But yeah, it's very low key. It is very modest, as you say.
Yeah, and I think the only things that really stand out are things that you pick up on in retrospect as a national fan, however many years or albums later that you're getting to this one, because it's just so quiet and unassuming. And while I think it's a good record, it's not particularly remarkable, I don't think.
You get a sense that this is a band that, and again, it's impossible to say whether this is just the influence of, retrospect and knowing what this band would go on to do, but I do think you get a sense that this is a band that is not exactly, pushing their limits here, but is holding
Yeah.
back, if anything, and are deliberately trying to do something that is a little more insular and self-contained. There is chief focus on the acoustic guitar as the lead point of instrumentation. There are moments on this record, I would say, where you get a little bit more distortion, where you get a little bit more edge. Songs like Sun, songs like Theory of the Crows, for instance. But for the most part, it just places you in this mood of being like slightly buzzed, slightly out of touch with reality, and slightly depressed as fuck as well. Like there are themes on this record that Matt comes back to a lot of: being stuck in a relationship where you have some degree of reliance on someone else, as someone who is frequently incapacitated, potentially due to alcohol and other things. There's this sense of like, the Midwestern ennui as well, of working in an environment that's just sort of soul sucking and empty. There is a sense of like looking at someone in your life and seeing like a vacant sheet staring back at you. There's a little bit of like spite and disdain in some of these songs, in the way that Matt talks about the people closest to him in some of these songs as well. There is like this persistent theme of awkwardness in sexual encounters and relationships as well. The sense of relying on substances to a certain extent to kind of get you through that awkwardness, but inevitably it creating more problems than it solves. And that theme of reliance on alcohol, I feel like, comes back around again and again and again throughout this record in a way that makes it, it's not a pleasant listen, I would say.
No. I think the biggest thing that stands out as a sort of missing element on this record in comparison to what would come after it is Brian Devendorf's presence behind the kit, which even in the Nationals' more quiet, reserved moments, the man is always still busy. It's always something that has set this band apart from their contemporaries and added something that seems so singular to them, how these really impressive drum parts can be integrated with plaintive indie rock. It's something that is hard to overlook in retrospect. And while it might seem that we are sort of stuck on the fact that this is the first national record and it is not as good as the rest of the national records, it does have a place in this discography, and it's very much worth listening to in that sense, just to get a sense of perspective.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I would say the most consistently remarkable, or at least interesting aspects of this record are mostly, if not entirely, wrapped up in Berninger's lyricism. Because I think that he lays out a style and certain motifs that are still, I would say, a fixture of his writing, even as he has evolved and changed and grown up and entered different stages of his life. There are certain ways in which he constructs a lyric, and there's certain reference points and images that he uses and ideas and motifs that he comes back to that are really outlined here, like even in the first lines of the record, you're walking taller than you should, the air is thin around your beautiful head, you're saying things with your mouth to me that I don't recognize. The thing about Matt that I've always found strangely enticing is that he's kind of deliberately clunky as a lyricist sometimes. Like one of the things he does a lot is he will utilize repetition in the way that he writes lyrics. Like he will say the exact same lyric twice in a row, or he will use a lyrical motif or a lyrical idea multiple times in a song, and he'll do it in a way that rather than feeling like it's taking from the effect of the line, it's kind of doubling down on it in a strange sense. Like you get when you listen to Matt sing, the effect is like someone who is incredibly drunk trying to get their thoughts out and saying things over and over and over again to try and get the delivery perfect, or to try and get the impact of what they're saying across, because their sense of social cues and their ability to to tell whether or not they're communicating themselves clearly to someone else is just completely gone because of the alcohol. And songs like Beautiful Head, I feel like so clearly convey that state of mind. There's this bitterness, there's this jealousy. There's a great chorus refrain in the song, "Do not tell me I've changed, you're just raising your standards," which is like such a Berninger lyric in terms of like,
Yeah.
don't tell me that I'm a fucking drunk. You're just all of a sudden too good for me because
you're just sober now. Ooh.
yeah, there's this sense of like refusing to acknowledge your own weaknesses. And it's something I feel like Matt would get more, it's interesting, he would get more violent and harsh about it in Sad Songs for Dirty Lovers, and then he would get more emotional and kind of just messy about it in Alligator, in a way that ultimately I think is the most compelling version of this lyrical style. But there's so much of it that is already here. A song that is one of my favorites on the record that really stands out to me is Cold Girl Fever, the second song here. It has this again stately pace, quite sort of repetitive musical ideas. It has this nice little synth that's layered into it, and it just has this sense of utter misery just baked into it. Bottle eyes, glassy blue, I watched the rain come out of you. That idea of using metaphors or describing the way that someone looks using language that again evokes alcohol, evokes drinking. There's lines in here like, "I promised to leave if you ever went cold, then to leave when I'm sleeping, you told me. Put your spine and your back and your arms and your coat, don't hold on to me when there's nothing to hold. It's not what you said, but that's what you meant. I'm losing my baby on promises kept. What are you for now that I have hardcore?" It's such a fucking brutal song about just like essentially responding to someone who is calling you out on all of the ways in which you are hurting yourself and hurting the people around you, by saying like, you are now pointless to me because you're not essentially reinforcing my vices and supporting me in the sense that you validate the ugly things that I do. And that emotional tone that comes through so frequently on this record is the most endearing, or at least the thing that I respond to it the most with. Like, I do come back to this record every so often, and I do listen to songs that have had an impact on me, and they are almost invariably the songs where that bitterness and cynicism and hatred kind of comes out. Another standout, I think, is Pay For Me, which is one of the more sort of jaunty songs on the record. It has a bit of lap steel in there, I think, and it has a bit of more of a twang to it and a bit of a faster pace. And the vocal delivery from Matt on this song, I think, is a little bit more memorable and impactful as well. I love the continuous set of lines where he's like, "Bottle from the duty free, I'll drink it all across the sea, lay me down in business class, headphones and a sleeping mask." Like, already that image, that idea of like middle to upper class wealth, and like this the kind of pathetic image that you kind of hold on to. It's very kind of, it's kind of like American Psycho, but slightly more sort of innocuous and sort of outwardly pathetic in a certain sense. Like, it's a post yuppie kind of like, this is the image that we're brought up to aspire to, essentially, and here's the vacuousness of it. I love the way he sings the lines. I'm in the dark without the stars. I've never seen a black so dark. He sings that like with like he's like it's the words are just vomiting out of his mouth. I love that stuff. Like it's not, you know, it is the high watermark of this album, so it's not going to be near the level of their best stuff, but it's a moment that stands out to me. Another moment that stands out that is one of my favorites that is much more low key is the song Bitters and Absolute, which I actually think is lyrically my favorite song on the record, even if it is incredibly spare musically. Just these lines cut, man. There's, sweetie, you don't look so good. Your bottom lip is bleeding. I cut it on your collarbone. Go on, go back to sleep. If I were a spy in the world inside your head, would I be your wife in a better life you led? So it's like he seemingly is taking the perspective of his partner in this situation, who is trying essentially to understand the motivations and the mind state of this person who has become so distant to them. And that lyric has always stayed with me. If I were a spy in the world inside your head, would I be your wife in a better life you led? Like, it's such a poetic way of getting across the idea that, you know, in the world that you occupy in your brain, like the fantasy of the life you wish that you had, essentially, would there be a place for me there? Like, if things were better for you, would we still be together? Or is this like just, am I completely superfluous on every level? It's really cutting. Like, I do you better than you do. I do you better than you ever will when I'm on Bitters and Absolute. Like, that shit. Yeah, it's kind of hard. But yeah, that's the aspect of this record anyway, just to kind of wrap up. That's the aspect of this record that I respond to the most, is the venom that Matt can get at certain points, just the sense of ugliness that the record can reach. But I would say also there's a certain extent to which maybe the full effect of that is hampered by how anodyne the album can sound at certain points. Like, it can kind of fly over you a little bit, which is what I would say is the biggest limitation of the record.
Yeah, sonically, I just think there's not enough here to really grab you if you're not already invested by something else, which you could be invested by Beringer's lyrics and delivery. You know, that's what's the most striking, the most consistently about this record. But if you don't have a history with this band, that listening to this record might be a little like homework sometimes. And sometimes if you do have a history with this band, maybe it will feel like homework then as well.
Well, I guess that's my cue.
the conspicuously silent one so far.
Is the thing is that this is a very peculiar album from the band, because everything that makes the National is more or less here. The production of the record notwithstanding, I think it's absolutely essential that if visiting this album that you listen to the 2021 remaster of it.
Yeah.
Because there are many limitations that this record has, and one of them is the production. And let me just say, I still have plenty of issues with how the remaster itself sounds. So going back to an older version of it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is going to change drastically about your opinion, but still, it's an improvement. I don't really think this album is that good. I would say it doesn't even really get over the line for me, and I think that it's just because all of those things that make the National that I mentioned are here, but like curiously misaligned. I find a lot of Matt's writing to be very like, some of it's emotionally potent and some of it's just kind of like irreverent, and like I almost find some of it like kind of silly, and like there's a charm in that, don't get me wrong, but it just feels sloppy. It doesn't feel like it's all working together to create a greater point, a lot like basically every other record in this discography. And I know that it's asking a lot for a band like this to have all of their idiosyncrasies in tune in order to create a good final product. But that's just the thing, is that they do that later, and that's just what makes this such a pain. This is an album that, like, in every way fights you in some respect if you have listened to their other albums. Like, there is no way to approach this in a way that feels like you aren't simultaneously selling this album short, but also like having yourself kind of be dragged along an album that is like very purposefully kind of a slog. And it's like, oh, it's the point that it's kind of gin soaked and monotone. I don't really like that about it.
Especially when it's a band that would go on to do that exact shtick so much more interestingly.
I've said time and time again on the podcast proper that the National are a fantastic drunk band. And that's just the thing, is that you have records like Trouble Will Find Me, which I think just, it is a level up of this idea in every way, shape, and form. So if you go back to it, it's like some early Pink Floyd records where you go back and it's just
It's
like,
a good comp, yeah.
Yeah, it's just like some of these you can't help but feel like, yeah, they're good songs on here, but overall the end product is like, it's a little functionally useless. Like, I know that sounds harsh. Don't get me wrong. I think there are good songs here. I think that the opening 1-2 punch of Beautiful Head and Cold Girl Fever is like pretty solid in my book, but I think the best song on here for me is probably a toss-up between American Mary or Theory of Crows. I really like the distortion on Theory of Crows. It feels like the most sonically distinct thing here, maybe like something that would make it onto like a later album like High Violet or something, that just kind of feels like it has that distinctly darker tone. And I also just like also Pay For Me as another pretty great song. But again, that production does kind of hold them back a little bit. And I guess that, like, it's very strange to hear this band like not know. I it's very indicative of the scene that they came out of, I think, in that another band that came from where this band came from around the same time, is The Strokes. And it's very interesting to see how indie rock and the shape of alternative music to come were kind of formed by bands exactly like this, except the National were distinctly like a flavor of this that was more uncool and took longer to form a following than other bands like them. And they arguably became more influential and more like, at least contain more lasting appeal than many other bands like that. And I guess it's sort of interesting to hear maybe why that was the case, that they didn't get that initial jumping off point, because, you know, this is it exactly. Like, you don't need the immediacy or anything, but the identity is like, it's just not quite there. And even if it's not fully there, I still think that it maybe takes an album or two for them to sort of arrive at where we know the National as a band to be. But even on songs like, or even on albums like the next one, for example, I still feel like they get this vibe across, because like I feel like even the most ardent of National fans, we can all admit this is a band that takes a considerable amount of patience to properly get into, just because there's lots of songs and lots of albums that don't contain a whole lot that like just leap out and pull you in immediately. You want to, like, when you recommend the National to someone, you recommend an upper tier record that also has a really distinct sound. That's why a lot of people tend to recommend something like High Violet. It's because it has a really immediate kind of cutting sound. It's got some of the band's best songs. So it's difficult to see what this band looked like without other like records and defining elements that give you it's this, version of their sound. But it's like, no, this is just the core, but it's simultaneously like it understands what they're trying to do. I just don't think it manages to do it. It's so fucking difficult to actually articulate my opinions on this record.
I think you make perfect sense. I want to pick up on the notion of National being uncool at this era, because what's funny is that they kind of have come to represent sort of Midwestern dadcore cool in a certain sense in their more recent era, like the slicked up suits and stuff, and the look that they've come to cultivate, the sense of like formality that is like the bit is that they look sort of formal, but then you kind of get to see them perform, and it's like the real, you know, deeply rooted emotion that's kind of hidden beneath the veneer of the formal middle upper class presentation starts kind of tumbling out.
There's the notion of them being a very like metropolitan kind of band that's for like, you know, again, people who like listen to records with like a glass of bourbon and fucking their like studio apartment in some given American city.
And the thing is, like, they were so far from that at this particular point. Like, they were, if you look at photos of the band actually from their early era, from the early 2000s, they look fucking dorky as fuck. They look, I mean, I'm gonna say it, they look awful. Like, it's just you see these guys and you're like, this is not a band, this is a Dungeons and Dragons group. Like,
look at these herbs.
Like,
I need that meme of that guy eating the cereal with like a picture, an early picture of what the National looked like, and it's just like, these men will never produce a Taylor Swift album, and then a picture of Folklore and him spitting out the cereal.
But my point being, there's a really funny story that Chris DeVille tells in his piece for the 10th anniversary of Alligator on Stereo Gum. And I was going to save this anecdote for that episode, but I actually think it maybe even fits better in here, which is that at the time when the National were coming up, they were the supporting band for indie buzz bands. And in 2005 specifically, which was a year that Alligator got like a 7.9 from Pitchfork or something, and Clap Your Hands Say Yeah, the indie buzz band of the moment, got like a best new music, and they were getting sort of super hyped up. And so they went on a tour off the back of this hype with the National as their supporting band. And like, the funny thing is, no one gave a shit about the National in this era. They would like turn up late to kind of miss this backing band. And then within an album's time, Clap Your Hands Say Yeah had been relegated to irrelevance, and the National were the ones drawing the crowd. And
lucky to tour with the National now.
Yeah, and so like, it speaks, I guess, to the growing pains, I suppose, of this early stage of the National. Although I do think, and I won't talk about it now, but I think there is actually a quantum leap between this and even the next record, where they still haven't found their sound, but it's a very, very interesting and underrated record that we can talk a lot about. But yeah, I think all of the strengths and weaknesses of the self-titled record can actually be found in the song Theory of the Crows. Like you say, it's the most animated musically. It has that harsher, more distorted guitar. It has that sense of danger to it that a lot of the rest of the record doesn't have. And it has some lines as well that really stick out for how acerbic and memorable they are. Like, I particularly like the line, I traded my daylight for a career. And at the end of the song, where he's like, I need mine to see me when I wake up. I need mine to know that I'm what they come to. The way he delivers that about his family as this kind of disaffected, you know, cubicle worker essentially, is quite powerful, although it's certainly something he would get to communicate more effectively on subsequent records. But the flip side of this is you also have some of, I would say, the worst and most clunky lyricism Matt's ever written in this song as well. Where crybabies cry in the United States, bright white on both sides, like a plate. Sure.
Yeah,
there's not enough money to buy a PC, so I'll come in this weekend to sleep on my feet. Sure. And the worst verse of this, pouring my fingers across the keys, will someone review my salary, please? I'm selling my time to the man who sells style. That time should be mine to waste on you. Actually, that line's not bad. But then the next part is, I'll suck off investors. I'll suck off VCs. I'm losing my posture from time on my knees. They treat me so well because I'll do anything. It's in the nature of service. Like, I get what he's doing there. The whole, like, you know, working in that environment is fundamentally like robs you of a certain dignity, and ultimately it's like parasitic. But it's very,
I don't want to about Matt Berninger blowing businessmen, frankly. I mean, that's just a very, like, that's, I feel like that's sort of an element that for me, there are songs, and I think they're the songs I prefer, where I feel like everything is a bit more in line, but I do feel like like most of the songs here, more or less, have some great verses, and then some verses that are just also not as good. So like the writing is just, it's not, it understands the goal. It doesn't quite get there. But I think the thing about this that I would say is my overriding feelings on the record is sort of like, again, the National are a very, they're a very depressed indie band that, lots of people like us listen to. And I feel like you have to be a certain level of instrumentally proficient, of you have to contain a level of idiosyncrasy, a certain voice. And I think that, again, as soon as their next record, they would do just that. But this sort of embodies what I would think that most people who don't like the National, or would picture the National as, sort of interpret their music to be, as it's just like, yeah, this album overridingly, if I'm a little less nuanced, is a very boring listening experience for me. It's very like, and it's compounded by the fact that it's like, if I want a slower, more stately album with more consistent writing and better instrumentation and far better production, there is no shortage of great albums I can go to in this band's own discography. It sort of undoes itself. This is a very much the National's Pablo Honey for me. I think that even then, that is an album that feels like it coasts on half-realized ideas, and that's more or less the case here. But with Pablo Honey, I prefer that by just a little tiny bit, because that's still an album that feels like it has an energy and a youth and a vitality to it, whereas this is just like, it's occasionally like listening to like your hungover uncle at karaoke just kind of slur his way through some very half-realized lyrics about, blowing businessmen or something. Thank you for that one.
Because every opinion that can exist invariably does exist, there may be some people out there who have an affection for this album greater than ours. If so, get in touch. Hit us up in the comments and let us know what you appreciate about this record, because like there are things I appreciate about it. So I'm sure there are other aspects that people appreciate too. And what I will say as well is, if you like the idea of this record, like this low-key kind of twangy indie rock, but you don't like the way they've executed it, I would recommend listening to a band like Pinback as well. Like, this reminds me so much of Pinback, except just fundamentally less instrumentally proficient and kind of sloppier. So yeah, there's lots of other bands I think that the National are taking from here, or who are incorporating to kind of try and find their identity, but it really just doesn't come together apart from certain moments that I find striking, but otherwise unremarkable.
This is an album that, like, if the Jams and Tea podcast were around when the National came on the scene, this is an album that would be put on the docket because Riley heard things about the band in like online circles, or like they have like a cult following from like live shows they've done, and we would review it and everyone would be like, yeah, this is kind of mid, and then Riley would be like, all right, I'm going to come through with a lukewarm defense of this record and then give it like 0.5 of a score higher than this one. Like, it's such a fundamentally kind of unremarkable experience that contains just enough to be able to defend them on the basis of, well, it's not the most boring thing in the world. So it like reminds me of the thing that it comes to mind is when you and Saoirse did your Sufjan Stevens video. One of my favorite things you say about his first record, you just go, not an auspicious debut for Sufjan. And it's I think about that when I think of like any first record that's just like,
yeah, that first Sufjan album sucks ass.
that's a lot worse than this, for the record. That's
yeah. Hey, look, all I'll say is,
all that.
if I'm to give like some praise that doesn't like have a caveat with it, I will say I do genuinely think that Cold Girl Fever is a great song. That's my unqualified personal opinion of positivity. All right, let's rate this bad boy then. Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite tracks on here gotta be pretty easily Pay For Me, American Mary, Theory of Crows. Least favorite song on here, I gotta go with the penultimate track, 29 Years, because this kind of embodies all of my issues with this album and basically has none of the strengths or potential caveats. I could say that like this feels like the most stereotypical the National type beat kind of song, and it's just so slow and so plotting, and Matt sounds like he's about to fall asleep.
That's the thing is, I would say one of
it's stinky.
the best thing about this record, I would say, even though it's not great, is the lyricism. But then you have Matt's who sounds genuinely shy throughout this record. Like he's just not quite got the confidence to fully sing the way that he can. And that is something
got a bit of a
change
hold on this record, and he's just like.
Sorry, what was he like again?
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't quite catch.
And your rating, Jake?
Oh, my rating is I'll say a 4.5 out of 10.
All right, Morgan.
My three favorites. I really like Sun, so I'll shout that one out as well. And Theory of the Crows and Cold Girl Fever. Least favorite, also 29 Years. Stinky. And I will give this 6 out of 10 overall.
My three favorite tracks are going to be Cold Girl Fever, Bitter as an Absolute, and Pay For Me. 29 Years is definitely the least fully formed thing here, but I'll say the song that I skip the most is John Star, just not a song that comes alive at all for me. Just really kind of boring, unfortunately. And yeah, I'm going to give this a 6 as well. I am broadly more affectionate than not on this record, and I do like songs like Sun and Watching You Well and The Perfect Song, songs I haven't mentioned that I do enjoy a fair bit. But yeah, it is what it is. It is the weakest National album. Actually, if anyone's listening at home who doesn't think this is the worst National album, please make your case below, because I would love
make yourself known.
I would love to hear that argument, just genuinely on a personal level. That gives us an average overall of 5.5 for the Nationals' self-titled album. Let us know at home what you think of this record, where it ranks in the discography for you. We will be back in 2 weeks' time to talk about the second National album, Sad Songs for Dirty Lovers. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already, especially if you do want to stick around for the whole retrospective. If you're new, then make sure you subscribe, and we will be back every 2 weeks with a new installment in this series. As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, absolute vodka, absolute perfection.